Hi, folks. Hi. I'm going to start with a story. Linda and Mary had a decision to make. They saw a fellow camper steal. It wasn't anything big, but it was stealing nonetheless. The camper took some of the items in the craft room, and the girls saw it all unfold. There weren't that many Negro children at the Chicago Commons camp, and the girls knew that in the summer of 1944, being selected to go away to swim and sleep in cabins and play games was something special, especially girls from Chicago's South Side. So they decided that upon seeing another Negro child involved in a petty theft, they had no choice but to tell someone. They informed a white counselor of the misdeed. He took the occasion to remind the other black kids there, the ones who were part of the grand experiment of the settlement house, and the social scientists who trained their well-credentialed and well-intentioned white camp counselors, that the girls did the right thing. They reminded the children that, quote, there could have been terrific repercussions if the crime went unsolved and the other Negro children would have to pay. While revising my dissertation, which later became the book Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, I read through the archives of the Chicago Commons summer camping program of the mid-1940s and early 1950s. I was struck by the counselor's notes of the interracial camping experiments of the period, and I often came back to the art room caper. I thought about the deep pressures felt by the black girls honored with the opportunity to attend a real camping trip, and I often wondered if they ever realized that they had actually accepted an invitation to be watched, noted, logged, and studied, to see if they would be able to be an asset to their white counterparts, who the camp believed could learn something from their presence. At camp, at church, at school, and on the street, black girls bore the weight of not only representing themselves, but they were the outward signs of their family's well-being or dysfunction. It was no doubt a tough spot to be in. A few years later, when Janie White went to the same camp, she found herself without a single friend, and the pressures of attending the camp was starting to weigh on her. Her mother had marched into the Chicago Commons house and told the white folks that she was anxious to have her daughter enjoy the types of things white girls took for granted: camping, after-school fun, and a feeling of safety in the city's parks. Janie knew that all of this lonely summer when she was away. Apparently, she could only keep so much to herself, and one of the counselors wrote in a journal that she was observed, quote, making a remark about her being Negro and having to live as others, meaning whites, want you to live. Janie never complained about being black, but she was labeled a bit of a problem. But she refused to do as some of the other black girls did, the ones who were praised for something called accepting their race. How many of us have felt like Janie, watched, controlled, and judged, misunderstood because we did not hate who we were? I think of Janie often, and I think of the way she and the other girls I met while writing Southside Girls has shaped my work as a historian, a thinker, and a teacher, and the ways that black girlhood studies is deeply indebted to righteous discontent for the intellectual energy it continues to offer us as historians of black women as well as black girls. I first read this book as a graduate student here at Brown University in Mary Jo Buell's women's history class, which also introduced me to the work of Tara Hunter, Deborah Gray White, and for the first time, I saw the foundations of myself as a historian. I also want to note my gratitude for the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America as it is today and as it was in the early 2000s as a graduate student hub for students of color. I think it's also important to acknowledge the ways that President Ruth Simmons, in her capacity as president of Brown, who was doing the work of looking at universities and slavery, something that is being done in so many campuses today, including my own, also helped us create a vision of black women's leadership of the academy. Her study was really an object lesson of remaining true to oneself in the face of so much criticism. And I also want to diverge from my comments to talk to the graduate students in the audience. When I was in my first year at Brown, I attended the celebration of 40 years of Black women's history at Harvard and Radcliffe, and then a few years later, I attended the retirement symposium for Nell Painter. And I thought to myself, I'm never going to finish a dissertation, let alone a book, let alone have a career. But after taking a moment to realize what I was witnessing, I saw how important it was to attend those types of events, to not only celebrate the incredible achievements of my mentors and intellectual influences, but to understand that others have been on this journey also. And at every turning point, a new set of challenges presents itself. In the years since first encountering Higginbotham's work on the Black Baptist Church, I've had the privilege of carving out an academic career that returns to a question first discovered at Brown. What if those our societies hold in contempt, Black girls, young women, poor people, students from households that earn a low income, were at the center of our inquiries? Although my research has taken a different path from Black women's history explicitly, at the heart of my work is this question of contempt, and not just contempt for contempt's sake, but rather how do people recapitulate the scrutiny and unkindness of the world in ways that allow them to survive, feel less encumbered, and to provide them room to envision something else. This is what the politics of respectability has provided me, a mode to think and understand actions that would be lost in my archival observations. As Higginbotham identified the Black church as a place where Black women could find a place for signifying practice, my research on Black girlhood has also searched for those spaces. In my book, churches, as well as campfire and Girl Scout troops, and even carceral spaces provided opportunities for Black girls to be in community with each other, to find places to signify their desires, rebel, assess and question the motives of their parents who brought them from the South to the North during the Great Migration. Black girls, bound up by the ways that race, gender, and age overdetermined what was possible for them, also did as the Black women's conventions did, in rejecting their depictions as having no value. And in my work, I amplify the value of Black girls' testimony as not only serving their own interests as they sought help and resources for themselves, but shaping the disciplines that were also growing up in the Great Migration. Without the courage of Black girls interviewed by sociologist E. Franklin Frazier and the budding researchers of Chicago's Institute for Juvenile Research, we would be left with no ways of understanding the dynamics of Black family life during the migration, the failures of the public school systems of the North, the social world of Black churches and community life, or the constant threat of interracial sexual abuse and labor exploitation in cities. I think about the girls like the Baptist women that Higginbotham has helped us to understand deeply, and how they establish their own set of standards and expectations for themselves and their peers in order to survive in Chicago's Black Belt, all while finding ways to tap into these constrained sites to realize power. They sought their own veils of respectability while interacting with authority, and even in moments in which they were demeaned, they made the plea for dignity. I think about the testimony of Rhonda. Rhonda Robinson was sexually assaulted by her stepfather, and she discovered she was pregnant. After later entering a relationship with a local boy named Morris, Rhonda hoped that she had finally found security and safety in her new boyfriend. But soon after becoming pregnant again, Rhonda was forced to end her relationship and was taken into state custody for delinquency. After recounting her assault, her being shunned by Morris's family, and her own embarrassment, she lingered on an experience that spoke volumes about her own desire to be more than the girl who was talked about and maligned in the community. She said, "The probation officer, she never says anything but the worst about me. When she took me to the court, she said, 'This is Rhonda Robinson, and this is her baby, and she had intercourse with her stepfather, and he is now in the pen.' She kept on saying, 'second baby.'" It's in these places that Rhonda and other girls linger that I find that the politics of respectability as a framework has allowed me to see Janie, to see the girls at camp, and to pivot my work from thinking about how Black adults viewed Black girls to how Black girls saw themselves, because it provided me a way of understanding the context in which girls grappled with disclosures around their own personal experiences of conflict, sexual experiences, abuse, and a host of other complex moments in their lives, and it helped me recognize the value of talking, in resisting the culture of dissemblance because you were too young to know better or too desperate not to seek freedom. This allowed me to listen for the ways that Black girls talked about what they expected from their own girlhoods, from each other, and the ways that morals and manners could not and did not always protect them, but gave them weapons against their enemies. We have to be clear in our teaching and use of the politics of respectability, which has been said so beautifully since our convening yesterday. Our conversations made me think about a recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education about Kimberly Crenshaw and the misapplication of the theoretical concept of intersectionality. And it's receiving blame for everything, including campus protests, Twitter fights, climate change will probably be intersectionality's fault soon enough. The article stated that, quote, Crenshaw finds such attacks tiresome and beside the point. I borrow from Crenshaw when I say that evoking the politics of respectability without thinking about its possibilities and understanding not only the motivations of people, but a way of looking is also tiresome and beside the point. Fortunately, there are scholars who have found the framework generative and grounding in Black girls' history. Southside Girls is part of a conversation in which us speakers didn't realize we were engaged in. And something I say to graduate students, when I went to grad school, the internet wasn't as good as it is today. And so we didn't have Facebook. I didn't have Facebook, and Google was not as strong as it was today. So you really didn't know who else was working on something unless you went to these gatherings. And so when my book was published in 2015, Crescent City Girls, The Lives of Young Black Women in Segregated New Orleans by Lakeisha Simmons also came out. And that was the same year that Amy Meredith Cox's Shapeshifters, Black Girls and the Choreography of Citizenship came out. And then the next year, Nazira Wright's Black Girlhood in the 19th Century came out. And so across disciplines, the politics of respectability has provided a lens into talking about how girls have constructed their own set of ideas about how and why you conform, you consolidate power, you mediate the tensions among your communities. And so today, the interest in Black girlhood studies has allowed for some of the best teaching as well as thinking of not only our work, but our archive. One of the challenges that I faced in graduate school when I said I wanted to write a book about Black girls is people said, that's really nice, you have no archive. And what I've learned from so many Black women's historians is that there is indeed an archive, which has been rendered invisible and impossible, not by the lack of girls' voices, but the misogyny and ageism that has structured notions of sources to exclude the many places that girls express their discomforts and displeasures, as well as their joy and happiness during various eras in Black history. Black girlhood studies is also responding to the urgency of the moment by historicizing how girls have long been shielded by and silenced through the practices of respectability, which have motivated Black women's organizings around their protection and care, but has also required them to remain silent about the traumas experienced in both home and community. When books like Monique W. Morris's Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, discusses Black girls missing school to help families care for other children in their household, I think about the girls in Southside Girls. When the contempt their teachers hold for them leads them to receive more out-of-school suspensions than their white peers, girls who are missing entire extracurricular activities because of dress code violations, and being sent to juvenile facilities for standing up for themselves, I see the direct line between the girls of the South Side, of the Crescent City, and Black girls today, who need our political intervention as well as our scholarly interest. Thank you.
Good morning. It is really a pleasure and an honor. I echo the thanks to Emily and to Trisha and to Stephanie and the entire staff of the CSREA for thinking and envisioning this gathering and for inviting me to participate. I also, of course, would like to especially thank Dr. Higginbotham for her work, along with the work of Dr. Sharon Harley and Darlene Clark-Hine, and so many of the pioneering generations of Black women historians who taught me, who taught us how to center Black women's lives in a historical discipline and an academic profession that has never fully appreciated us, and have shown us how to do it with brilliance, grace, and style. Now, anyone who knows me or has spent any time with me or seen even my Twitter bio, I guess, would know that I have lots to say and lots of opinions about the subject of respectability and the politics thereof. I find it a particular irony that I'm losing my voice on the day when I actually have a chance to share some of these thoughts publicly and in a semi-coherent fashion, but I take that as a grace to keep me from going on. But this conversation has just been so enriching, and so in the time that I have with you, I'm going to talk a lot about context, the context in which I encountered this work, the context in which this work emerged, and the context in which many of the critiques of the politics of respectability have emerged. But before I do that, to give you a sense of the trajectory of my scholarship, if you will, I'm going to start with two stories from the recent past. One dating to August 2015, a story that I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with, when 10 Black women boarded a historic rail car in Northern California to embark on an antique train ride to enjoy a day of spring wine and beholding the scenic beauty of Napa Valley. The women, ranging in age from 30 to 85, were members of the Sisters on the Reading Edge Club. They shared appetizers and merriment as the Napa wine train made its way down a 25-mile journey. As they got into their journey, not long after, the women were asked to leave the train, escorted by the train's maitre d' through 6 rail cars, in the words of one of the women, as if they were criminals, forced to exit the train onto a dirt lot at St. Helena Station and handed over to 4 police officers. The reason given for this treatment: they were laughing too loudly and being disruptive. Now, the women who were on their 17th annual summer outing conceded that they were enjoying one another's company. They were celebrating a birthday, so they were in an especially festive mood, and they thought, perhaps erroneously, that a wine train might be a place to enjoy themselves. All we were doing, one of the women explained, was laughing, having a good time, and trying to discuss our book. Yet the very joy they expressed was an affront to those who witnessed it. A few years later, as the chill of winter thawed into the spring and the sun finally decided to make an appearance in York County, Pennsylvania, 5 Black women decided to take advantage of a chilly but otherwise pleasant day to improve their golf game. They had recently become members at the Grandview Golf Club, were looking forward to improving their skills, but as they teed off on the second hole, the women were confronted by some men at the club and asked to leave, and told that their club membership would be canceled. When asked why, they were told that they were moving too slowly, something the women refuted and something that I would think would be very hard to do on a golf course, moving slowly. According to Sandra Thompson, one of the golfers, who was also a lawyer and a president of the York County chapter of the NAACP, many of us were having great drive days. We were slamming the ball, so when they said too slow of a pace, that was just false. The women refused to vacate. The country club employees called the police. When they arrived, the officers thankfully decided this was not an arrest-worthy offense. But the words of one of the women explaining how they interpreted the day and what they set out to do, she said, quote, "We are professional women in our 50s trying to enjoy ourselves, and were victimized, sexualized, and harassed playing golf." Now, in each of these examples, the Black women set out to enjoy themselves, whether celebrating literature, a birthday, on a train, or improving their golf game on a chilly spring day. And in each of these examples, their pleasure turned to peril as the presence of laughing and golfing Black women was deemed suspicious, dangerous, and criminal. Now, to be sure, these women were not detained long-term, physically harmed, or in the case of the Napa Valley wine train, which was full of lawyers, they were compensated for their inconvenience once they sued. And in light of the more violent and extreme examples of anti-Black violence and police killings, these encounters in many ways pale in comparison. And while these incidents and countless others that we've all seen circulating through the media are similar, and they inspire a healthy dose of outrage, as a Black woman historian, I contend in the way that I frame my work that they reflect many of the issues and tensions at the heart of my work as a scholar, and many of the issues and tensions, I think, at the heart of the masterpiece that Evelyn Higginbotham has given us. So as I consider this task of our panel of reflecting on the ways the politics of respectability has insisted, and I love that word, insisted its relevance as an interpretive tool, I cannot do that without thinking about the way that I encountered the text. And I love the intergenerational sharing of different scholars who have gotten up here and talked about their encounter. And I encountered it as a young 20-something graduate student in Deborah Gray White's African American History Seminar at Rutgers University. The very first class I took in graduate school. It was the very first book I read as a graduate student. And as I like to remind my students, I was trained in the last century, and it was a glorious time. I feel like that explains a lot to them when I put it in those terms. But it was, and for those of you that were not sort of coming of age as a scholar in that moment, it was a glorious time to be an impressionable scholar learning the ropes of Black women's history. And I think when the annals of Black women's history continue to be told, the 90s will stand out as a golden age within the field. After the battle for the institutional existence of Black studies and women's studies in the late 1960s and 70s, culminating in many ways with the publication of Sharon Harley and Rosalind Terborg Penn's The Afro-American Woman, which Professor Harley alluded to yesterday, the creation of the Association of Black Women Historians in 1979. The 80s then gave rise to paradigm-shifting works, including, and there are others, but including Deborah Gray White's Aren't I a Woman and Paula Giddings' When and Where I Enter. And by the 90s, I want us to sort of appreciate the moment in which politics and respectability comes in. There was such, in that short amount of time, such a flourishing of Black women's history that there was enough to fill this 16-volume opus, which if you have not seen it, containing almost 250 articles, as well as 5 monographs, the Black Women in U.S. History series edited by Darlene Clark Hine, Elsa Barkley Brown, Tiffany Patterson, and Lillian Williams. Truly an extraordinary accomplishment just less than 20 years after Black women's history became a legitimate field of study. I encourage those of you who are doing this work now to go back and look at those volumes, look at those articles, look at those essays, look at We Specialize in the Wholly Impossible, The Reader in Black Women's History, right? Because I think when we look at them, we see them as manifestos. I look at it at this moment as if Black women historians were writing themselves and writing the field into existence. If the journals wouldn't publish their work, they published themselves. And so in 1996, the year that I entered graduate school, Francine Roussan Wilson wrote a review essay that included Righteous Discontent, published in Feminist Studies, examining the scholarship produced within the preceding 5 years. And what she said about this moment was, quote, "Theory is the final step in the recent contextualization of Black women's history. Not only have Black women's voices been recovered, but the most exciting new scholarship demands that we examine the precise process of their silencing." And so that is the moment in which this work is emerging, where there's such an impetus behind theory and understanding these silences, whether it's through the culture of dissemblance, whether it's Nell Painter's reconceptualization of soul murder, whether it's Elsa Barkley Brown's Gumbo Yaya, all of that is happening at the moment of the politics of respectability and the work of righteous discontent. And so when I think about myself and my encounter with this work, I am, which as a Gen Xer seems to be my lot in life, of the sandwich generation, right? I'm caught between those who created these theories and seemingly between those who seem to set out to want to destroy them. And when I reflect on the current state of Black women's history with regard to the politics of respectability, I'm troubled by a few things. I'm troubled by a lot of things, but I'll just share a few. One, I'm troubled by the way that many scholars and those influenced by them in undergraduate classrooms and wider publics have oversimplified the rich theoretical framework, which many people have talked about today. A theoretical framework, I argue, is important to understand as being rooted in the Black public sphere, which was also an intervention that was coming in the 1990s into fruition, and so brilliantly theorized with Evelyn Higginbotham's work, trading that complication for a hashtag, which is essentially what respectability politics has become. And the distinction between a theoretical framing and a hashtag is where we need to think of it. Is there a place for hashtags? Absolutely. Does it do the same work as a theoretical framing? Absolutely not. I'm also troubled, and this gets back to my early vignettes that I shared with you, by the way that pleasure, and some of this came out of Shaniqua Roach's work beautifully, the way that pleasure has been pitted as the antithesis of respectability, as if the two were not experienced simultaneously by Black women, and perhaps more importantly, as in the examples of the women with which I open my remark, we see, and this is part of what Dr. Higginbotham's work shows us, that Black women asserted their right to pleasure often on the basis of their identities as respectable professional Black women. That both of these strategies, and if we think of them as strategies, often work in tandem or often used strategically at particular moments. And the arc of my own research is situated, and these examples that I began with, I hope illuminate that space between political strategy and resistance where respectability meets pleasure, and thinking of those things together. So whether examining the political activism of Black beauticians, the subject of my first book, Beauty Shop Politics, who asserted their right to lead their communities based on their roles as respectable businesswomen who provided a place for Black women to restore their dignity through aesthetic pleasures, but also to engage in political work, or in my current research project, Civil Rights on Vacation, about Black travelers, but Black women being the majority of these travelers, and travel entrepreneurs who make claims to the domestic and social and global citizenship, this idea of a domestic and global citizenship, on the basis that they were hardworking, well-educated women who had the right to experience leisure without being bothered by the insidious nature of American racism. And so I'm glad I came of generation in came of age in this particular moment of the 90s, a time when there was a bounty of scholarship on blues women and club women, when the discussion around them was robust, but always intellectually sophisticated, where there seemed to be, at least to my graduate student eyes, more of a healthy dialogue and less of battle lines drawn between pleasure and respectability. And Evelyn Higginbotham's work helped to complicate any overly simplistic binaries about Black women's lives through the politics of respectability by showing how these women offered a political vision that, in Higginbotham's words, vacillated between the attack on the failure of America to live up to its liberal ideals of equality and justice, and an attack on the values and lifestyle of those Blacks who transgress white middle-class propriety. There's so much framing in that book has that kind of duality. That nature of complication is built in and of itself into the theorization of the politics of respectability that is often missing. The complicated worlds of Black womanhood are further underscored when you read Righteous Discontent in conversation with some of Higginbotham's other work. The article that literally, I'm telling you, for every paper I wrote in graduate school, I found a way to cite this article because it was so illuminating to me. The Rethinking Vernacular Culture piece on Black religion and race records in the 1920s and 30s, one of my all-time favorite articles of all time. I tell graduate students, you find an article you like when you're in grad school and sort of model and mimic it till you get it right. That was part of my model and mimic. I'm still trying to model and mimic and still trying to get it right. But this brilliant piece where Higginbotham uses the lens of race records to warn against the oversimplification of the Black working class. Much of that work that she shared with us yesterday comes out of this same sentiment. Since working class folks were not just claiming their right to pleasure by jamming to the blues, right? We think of the blues as this working class ethic and religious experience as this kind of bourgeois thing. She's showing that the same people who are jamming to the blues are also those consuming gospel records, right? And sometimes they're not the same people, but they're all within the same community. And that they're making these claims to respectability in holiness churches, in denominational churches, but that this is coming rooted from the working class. That kind of layer and complexity, as I said, is something I still am trying to achieve in my work. And speaking of the church, we miss a great deal, and this is one of the things that I don't even understand because it's so built into the work, if we lose sight of the fact that Higginbotham's discussion of the politics of respectability is rooted in the Black church. Of course, that doesn't mean that the framing of the politics of respectability cannot be applied in other contexts. In fact, Black folks of the time used and debated the language of responsibility rigorously in the early 20th century, both inside and outside of their spiritual communities. But what is missed if we don't take the role of the Black church seriously in the powerful intervention Higginbotham makes about the dialogical and contested nature of the Black public sphere? That's really, to me, what's at the heart of that book. Both the dialogical and contested nature of the Black public sphere, but also of Black institutional life more generally. And the Black public sphere was, according to Higginbotham, it's to me the clearest example in any text of defining it. It was a discursive, critical arena in which values and issues were aired, debated, and disseminated throughout the larger Black community, right? So thinking about this hegemonic idea, but instead thinking about the Black church as a dialogical space within the Black public sphere. So the discourse and debates we see throughout righteous discontent about the role and utility of respectability, they're not of the Black Twitter variety, where you can fool yourself into thinking that you're engaging someone, but in many cases, you have little or no interaction with these people outside of the digital space. And I think that's what's really important, right? That if we think about the questions around respectability that were happening at the moment, they're happening within this institutional space of the church, right? Where people have to worship together, live together, figure things out. When politics of respectability or respectability politics is debated as a hashtag in Black Twitter, we're not anchored by that kind of institutional world. And I think that that makes a big difference. And I contend that much of the criticism about the politics of respectability that happens in the digital space is really an anxiety about our cultural moment in which we're grappling with what does it mean to be a part of the Black public sphere in a digital age, right? What does that look like, right? We talk about Black Twitter. I love Black Twitter. It is a public sphere, but outside of institutions, it changes the dynamics. And so I think a lot of this anxiety about it is rooted in that. And something else that I think the work that Higginbotham laid out for us, that it does, that I often see lacking in contemporary discussions about Black women's lives, is, and this was so important to me as a graduate student at the time, as a woman who was coming into her own faith in a particular kind of way, is that Higginbotham took the faith of these women seriously. Really seriously. Again, that was something that spoke to me on a personal level, but I'm always amused and think that we should engage in this practice where we have the t-shirts that Dr. Ford talked about that say things like "Believe Black Women," right? I believe that that needs to be paired with an effort to believe Black women about what they believe, whether or not you agree with what they believe. And I think a lot of that is missing in our conversations about these women's lives, about the source of where they're getting their ideas about respectability. Believe what they thought about piety, morality, and thrift is coming from a very deeply rooted place. It was not, as Higginbotham reminds us, and these are her words, a mindless mimicry of white behavior, but was instead informed by the theology of these women, a well thought out, prayed over, developed theology that impacted every aspect of their lives, including their decorum, their dress, and their politics. So far from being an emulation of whiteness, Higginbotham explains that their emphasis on, quote, manners and morals served to reinforce their sense of moral superiority over whites. That is one of my favorite interventions in this book. This was not about modeling around whites, but showing through their own behavior that they, in fact, were superior to whites, and particularly white Christians. So I'm going to try to pull all these thoughts, this kind of journey through my 1990s and encountering this text and thinking about its impact. by thinking about the 1990s not just as a golden age of Black women's history and Black women historians theorizing, but it also was, and I will take no debate on this, there's no kind of dialogue about this, it was also undoubtedly the golden era of hip hop, period, end of discussion. I'll engage in intellectual conversations about everything except that, right? So we're having artists like Tribe Called Quest and Pete Rock and CL Smooth and Gangstar who are continuing the hip hop tradition that Trisha Rose's book just completely taught me everything I know about those early years. But what was fun about the 90s, right, is that they're sampling off of jazz in really explicit ways, right, and the jazz catalog. And now that I've become one of those middle-aged profs who rolls up to campus in her SUV bumping her classic hip-hop station, my favorite, the only thing I really listen to is LL Cool J's Rock the Bells Radio on Sirius, right? And there's one of my favorite segments, I'm making a point here, I promise. There's one of my favorite segments on the station, and it's something called Salute the Sample. Has anybody heard when they do Salute the Sample? And in Salute the Sample, they'll play, a jazz song, like they'll play it in its entirety, or a funk song, and then they'll follow it by the hip hop song that sampled it, allowing the listener to appreciate the beauty of both the original song and the innovation of the new. And I love that now. There's a part of me that when I was listening to hip hop at that moment probably didn't want to hear that original jazz. But there's something about hearing the beauty of that jazz and then how it gets executed in this new, brilliant, and innovative way makes it powerful. So last week in the graduate course I was teaching, we read Shanette Garrett Scott's wonderful and brilliant new book, Banking on Freedom, on Black women in banking and finance. And in it, she has a nuanced and rich discussion on the ways Black women utilize the politics of respectability as a way to mitigate risk when dealing with financial institutions. It's brilliant. But I noticed something that my students kept referring to respectability politics in our discussion, even though Garrett Scott never even uses that term herself. She's explicit about using the politics of respectability. So I said, wait, pause. We need to have a salute the sample moment. And I asked them, and I told them, and went on, and it reminded me to never teach this class again without teaching Higginbotham's work, because they need that. But I asked them what they knew about politics of respectability and where it originated and all that. They didn't. All they knew was the hip-hop version, if you will, the version that had taken the sample and done something new with it. And when we returned to the conversation, after I went in this whole thing saluting the sample, they still continued to use the term respectability politics, which I think is interesting. So I called them to salute the sample, yet they could only still hear the hip-hop version. And so as Black women's history matures into its fourth decade as an academic discipline, I do not think that we're done with providing theoretical frameworks. To the contrary, I think one thing that the respectability politics hashtag has taught us is that there is a greater public that is hungry for the flourishing of theoretical frameworks to understand their experiences. However, in our quest to create these new theories, we have to be careful, and every now and then we need to go back to salute the sample. Jazz never went out of style even as hip-hop transformed it. We don't have to dismiss jazz in order to appreciate hip-hop or to argue for its relevance. And as each generation of scholars and activists interpret and reinterpret the role and relevancy of respectability, I will never stop saluting the sample. So thank you, Evelyn, for such a rich tapestry of beauty and brilliance like that of the jazz greats. You have caused so many to recreate their own worlds of meaning and interpretation. Thank you.
So first, I just want to express my tremendous gratitude for the invitation to be here. Thank you to Stephanie LaRue and to everyone at the CSREA. Thank you to Trisha Rose and to Emily Owens. By now, it seems worth mentioning, is my sister. And above all, thank you to Professor Higginbotham for the work and the legacy that has brought us all here today. So keeping very much in line with the theme of this panel, I'm going to speak about respectability as it has shaped the study and my understanding of Black girlhood, and more specifically as it has shaped my ability to interpret and understand the performance of Black girlhood historically. I'll begin by introducing you to the subject of this talk, Philippa Duke Schuyler, a Black girl known in the 1930s and 1940s as the Shirley Temple of American Negroes. 3 years old in 1934, Philippa Schuyler was already at the start of a long public career of precociousness. Before Philippa turned 5 in 1936, she was known across the United States as a piano prodigy, and sometimes merely as a colored prodigy, girl prodigy, or the Harlem prodigy. First gaining citywide and then national and international attention, Philippa commanded concert halls with her virtuosic piano performances of Bach and Mozart, and with her own experimental compositions. Profiled by Time, Look, and The New Yorker by the age of 9, Philippa fulfilled the expectations of prodigy in the era of Shirley Temple, the white child film star to whom she was compared. Schuyler, like Temple, was masterful and disciplined, and yet admired for her disarming cuteness and charm. Described by reporters as a graceful, beautiful child with enormous liquid black eyes that sparkled with her cheerful demeanor, Philippa captivated audiences aesthetically and affectively. Well before Philippa took the stage or achieved public recognition, however, she was already performing a version of exceptional Black girlhood that her parents had designed and that her mother studiously managed. As the archive of her early life, a series of scrapbooks crafted by her mother, explicates, Philippa's exceptional status was staked over her mother's rigorous pedagogy and dietary regimens, and by both of her parents' shared belief that they had afforded Philippa especially strong genetic material for a life of uncommon quality. The daughter of Josephine Schuyler, a white writer from Texas, and George Schuyler, the Black journalist and novelist, Philippa was born in Harlem in 1931, the same year that her father published Black No More, his biting speculative satire of race in America. Josephine and George frequently pronounced themselves racial outliers for their Black-white partnership and disdain for politics of racial unity. Yet, however much they resisted forms of racial nationalism, they did not disavow the explanatory power of race, nor the political currents of New Negro exceptionality and respectability that permeated their Harlem social world and informed their vision for Philippa's future. Parenting Philippa in a period characterized by nationwide fascination with the making of so-called better babies and fitter families, a period rife with contestation over the racial future of the U.S., Josephine and George conscripted Philippa into a pedagogical role, seeking for her to, quote, challenge the set notions of America on race, a living proof against segregation and the libel of mixed-race degeneracy, and quietly investing in the eugenic theory of hybrid vigor, which proposed that racially heterogeneous persons exhibited superior human fitness to those of homogeneous origin. The Schuylers provocatively appealed to the epistemological power of racial science, assuming race as a stable category for forecasting human improvement. Given the white supremacist foundations and horrific fate of 20th century eugenics, the Schuylers' engagement in what critics have called a eugenic project or breeding experiment has rendered them estranged, sometimes altogether illegible, within accounts of African American family politics across the early 20th century. And given Philippa's placement at and as the center of the Schuylers' so-called experiment, Philippa has rarely, if ever, been considered a subject that can instruct us about anything other than the strangeness of her own life. Consciously raised to be an exception, deemed a prodigy, and a gifted child, Philippa's life and legacy has remained in the under-examined territory that exceptions so often occupy. Yet today, I want to suggest that George, Josephine, and Philippa were deeply entangled in a broader set of New Negro politics rooted in early 20th century Black constructions of respectability. Moreover, that their attempts to outdo hegemonic parenting, Black or white, comprises an extension, empirical, experimental, and ill-fated, of the simple yet politically insurgent claim that Black people and their Black daughter were worthy of respect. Their particular investment in eugenics, while strange, in fact marks a much broader engagement between African American claims for social, political, and human worthiness and the period's hegemonic metrics and scales of human stature. Understood in this frame, I want to propose that Philippa, who shouldered the burden of her parents' and the public's expectations of exceptionality, is an incredibly significant figure for understanding the politics, strategies, and most importantly, the performance of respectability that she and other Black women and girls across the 20th century embodied to shape, shift, and map geographies within, outside, and against available rubrics. The archive of Philippa's girlhood and career demonstrates that Philippa was well practiced in performing respectability as a crucial facet of performing her childhood giftedness. Raised on a special diet, raw vegetables, raw meat, cod liver oil, and sunbaths, and taught to read before she turned 2, Philippa became newsworthy for her spelling accomplishments before 3 and scaled IQ tests at NYU and Columbia before she was 4. As her musical career developed, so did her impeccable self-presentation. When Philippa took the stage, she was poised, polite, and prepared to astonish audiences with her virtuosic playing. The archive of her career relates, through clippings, awards, and commentary, that across the 30s and 40s, Philippa's career, her public acclaim, and her skill at performing continually expanded. Below the pristine surface of Philippa's archive and its progressive arc, however, another Philippa appears in the scrapbooks. There is 5-year-old Philippa who resolutely refused to play before an impatient panel of white producers. There is the wily Philippa who, after learning to recite County Cullen's poem, Heritage, or What is Africa to Me, at the age of 2, evaded Josephine's demand that she spell Spain by wisecracking, "What is Spain to me?" There is the 4-year-old Philippa who took apart stories of her Wag and Puff primer, of dogs and rabbits and little houses, rewriting them into asymmetrical poetics that seem to eerily anticipate Toni Morrison's deconstructed use of childhood primers across the bluest eye. And there is the Philippa who proclaimed her love of discord, writing compositions about cockroaches scuttling, wolves prowling, and storms brewing over New York City in minor keys and dense chord progressions. This Philippa, as studiously attentive to subversion as to discipline, appears unruly, clever, willful, dazzling, and shape-shifting. Beneath press clippings, IQ metrics, and Josephine's notes on her development, Philippa's own stories, drawings, compositions, and acts of defiance derail the progressive telos of her ascent to exceptional human stature, revealing tensions that underwrote her public performance of respectable, prodigious Black girlhood. To recognize this other Philippa, audible in her strange minor melodies and visible across her chameleonic practices of self-portraiture, is to draw on the resources of Professor Higginbotham's work and on the genealogy of scholarship that, following Higginbotham, has extended her methods for discerning the practices, relations, and acts of Black women and girls engaged in politics of respectability. Higginbotham's work has attuned us to recognize respectability not as a monolithic identity, but as a series of accumulated, embodied, and highly self-conscious social practices modulated across public and private, and negotiated across racial, class, and gendered strata. Not a dogma that Black women and girls have either lived by or refused to live by, but a set of shifting practices, a negotiation, and a method in itself. Higginbotham's concept of the politics of respectability has had such a profound effect on the study of Black women and girls' lives, not only because Higginbotham precisely described an important social phenomenon, but because she modeled a method for deconstructing it and named the stakes of it. Training us to see the politics of respectability as a, quote, fluid and shifting position along a continuum of African American resistance, Higginbotham attuned us to respectability as a strategic, roving position between two poles, between the hegemonic values of white America and the subversion and transformation of hegemonic racial and gendered subordination. Writing that the politics of respectability comprised a, quote, dialogue with oneself and others, Higginbotham invited us to approach its central claim, Black women's worthiness of respect, as an orienting point from which to map multiple political vectors, class positions, projects, and performances. Indeed, the analysis of respectability as politics and performance has become one of the most compelling sites for respectability's further elaboration and discussion. It is the study of respectability as performance that has prepared me to approach Philippa's archive and that which I want to draw our attention to today. Scholars of performance have continually drawn on Higginbotham's work to unpack the choreographies, gestures, movements, and shapes of respectability across time, archive, and discipline. Amy Meredith Cox's ethnography, Shapeshifters, Black Girls, and the Choreography of Citizenship, for instance, extends Higginbotham's line of inquiry into the contemporary moment, pursuing the, quote, theoretical performances and methods Black girls use to shift the shape of spaces they inhabit. Though the repertoire of the young Black women in Cox's study largely comprises a rejection of the repertoires of Black church women a century earlier, Cox's work reminds us that Black women's claims for respect have required shifts in strategy over time in relation to the shifting grounds of hegemonic subordination. Indeed, insubordination and respectability have a close relationship, as Higginbotham originally noted and as work by Jana Brown on Black women performers has clarified. The habits of Black church women and of those women they sought to reform in the early 20th century operated in a dynamic tension, the former moving toward what Higginbotham referred to as common ground with white America, and the latter refusing that common ground and forging roots outside of it. The unruly and willfully disobedient acts of Black women that Brown describes as shaping the modern in Babylon Girls become legible as political performances precisely as they contend with respectability, disclosing class antagonisms and status differentiation between Black women performing respectability in everyday life and Black women claiming the insurgent ground of the stage. Brown's attention to the insubordinate performances of Black women on stage points back to respectability's tense relationship to drama, spectacle, and stage culture, despite respectability's performative construction. This tension not only clarifies the stakes of Philippa's ability to perform as both a prodigy, a human curiosity, and a respectable Black girl at once. It also reminds us of the multiple arenas, orientations, and public-private dynamics of respectability politics. To trace Higginbotham's concept across its multiple sites of articulation, from the stage to the pulpit to the shelter to the home to the street, scholars following Higginbotham have mined new methods aligned to the particularities of each site. To trace a, quote, new history of colored girls and their experiments with freedom, as Sadia Hartman's recent work does, requires mapping the residual presence of the continuum of African American resistance that Higginbotham originally identified across its institutional and ephemeral archives and in search of its respectable and wayward acts. Though plotted apart on a political continuum, the wayward and the respectable might also be embodied in one single archive and in one Black woman or girl alone. Negotiated between herself, her parents, and her audiences, respectability and waywardness both appear in Philippa's archive, demonstrating the profound choreography and strategy involved in staking a claim for one's respect as a Black girl in the 1930s. Informing my approach to the complex relationship between inner and outer worlds, regimen, and unruliness across Philippa's archive, Higginbotham's work has also given me a frame in which to contextualize her life on more material historical ground. As Higginbotham originally demonstrated, the significance of respectability has not only been in its individual embodiment, but in its dynamic movement from the personal to the political, from the individual to the collective, in dialogue and on a continuum. To make a case for Philippa's exceptional performances and inner world-making as politically radical, her inward insurgent potential must be placed in relation to the outer world that she navigated, a world in which her performances of respectability were a currency, and in which her IQ, her beauty, and her proximate whiteness satisfied white and Black interests in producing ever more respectable, ever more exceptional members of race and nation. Striving to make an irrefutable, empirical case for Philippa's worthiness of respect, the Schuyler's approach to Philippa exposes the doubleness of respectability and its potential to betray Black people, especially as it conjoined with eugenic fantasies of human perfectibility in early 20th century politics. For no matter Philippa's standing on the chart of human stature, her place within the science of the human and within the white-dominated construction of girlhood, womanhood, and citizenship, Philippa's place was an unstable one. Facing increasing racism across the 1950s and 60s, as a Black woman performer no longer palatable to whites for her cuteness, Philippa Schuyler's career ended in frustration, in her turn along with her parents toward reactionary right politics, and in her young death at the age of 35. This conclusion might be taken as a comment on the ills of respectability politics. Yet I believe it is more a comment on the enduring perils of performing Black girlhood in America, whether respectable, unruly, or otherwise, and whether striving for common ground or making a new map. The Shirley Temple of American Negroes was never a stable performance to manage. It was a performance undertaken in the shadow of white girlhood, an uneasy and potentially crushing location for a Black girl. Rather than leaving Philippa there under that name, I invite us to consider Philippa not a Black approximation of Shirley Temple, but as a figure in a genealogy of Black girls and women who performed politics of respectability and unruliness, who shapeshifted, and who mapped a continuum of inner and outer freedoms across the last century. Black women and girls who we have come to know by their own names.